Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. We are finishing up the sub-series on inscribed equilateral polygons. And when we started this, we said that there were 3 polygons that were equilateral that could be inscribed in a circle using a straight edge and a compass, which means that you can, everything else is an estimate. They are the equilateral triangle, the 3-sided figure, the square, the 4-sided figure, and the pentagon. Now there are an infinite number of equilateral polyhedra which could be constructed with a straight edge and a compass, and they could be inscribed in a circle, but none of them is simple. They're all compound. For example, if we take the hexagon, which we're going to talk about next time, that's the simplest form of a compound figure, and that's made up of 2 trines set off at 180 degrees from each other, 2 equilateral triangles. And there are an infinite number of polyhedra that cannot be constructed with a compass and a straight edge. And the simplest of them is the septagon, or the septical, a 7-pointed star. Now, in this talk, we're going to talk about the last of these 3 figures, the equilateral pentagon. And it introduces some new thinking in spiritual mathematics that carry on from what we said earlier. The first is that it is capable of 2 different types of representations. That is, if you have a gyre of 5, which we have up here now, and it produces 5 points equidistant on a circle, there are 2 types of figures that you can produce from those 5 points. Now, in the first talk, we said that the conjunction and the opposition, which represent the point and the straight line, were not geometric aspects because they didn't produce a geometric figure. They are non-geometric in that they don't have an inside and they don't have an outside. They could be called elemental, or they could even be called foundational. The equilateral triangle and the square are geometrical, but they're simple. So if we make the 5 gyre points, if you have 3 gyre points like this, there's only one way that each point can be connected to any other point, and that is as the triangle. But the square is different. Each point can be connected with each other point in several ways. Either to make the square or to make the cross. And so there are 2 different representations. You can have either a square or you can have a cross from the same points. And so that's the first time that we have 2 different figures from the same set of points. But one of them is really not a geometric figure. It doesn't have an inside and outside, and it's only just crossed lines. Since all of the angles are right angles, there is no deflecting a square. Like the trine is subtle in that the center is never passed through, and the outside is deflective. But the square, the outside is always blunt. Now, there are 2 ways of connecting all of the points of a, if there's a 5-point gyre. Oops. That's one, and that's the pentagon. Another way, it produces the pentacle. It produces the 5-pointed star. So this is something new. In the progression of figures, as we go up the number of gyres, first we have no geometric figure, then we have a simple geometric figure that can't be divided in any way from the points, and then we have something that is a figure but with a cross in, and now we have two completely different geometric figures. And none of the lines goes through the center. So again, the pentacle, even more, in some ways more than the trine, is subtle. And it's interesting that this is also the first figure that feeds on itself. Because if you connect any 2 points like here, 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 you have another pentacle. Or if you extend the pentagram out, you get another 5-pointed star. Oops. Oh, yeah, here, major error. And then I suppose there's one more here, huh?
Yeah, no, 37.
There. And so you get a inverted 5-pointed star.
I was going to say it's opposite, yeah.
And then you connect them again, and you have another pentagon, and you can go in an infinite regression inward, feeding on itself by connecting points, or on an infinite regression outward, connecting points on itself. All of the figures that are equilateral and capable of construction with a compass and a straight edge, from here on in, have this same quality. They have the quality of feeding on itself. And I'm not certain, for example, what this means. I tend to think it has to do with something like a principle that gets played against itself. When the manifestations are enough, they multiply in reflections. And I think that is the kind of quality that's involved, but we'll get to that a little bit further on. Now, so the star form is something altogether new to us. With the pentagon following after the square, and looking ahead, another trend is introduced, in that all of the odd-numbered figures, when the gyre points are connected, none of the lines pass through the center. And all of the even-numbered figures do have lines that pass through the center of the circle. When they do, the connecting lines obviously have to be oppositions. Now this means several things. For one, it means that all even-numbered figures have an internal tension that is symbolized by the opposition, which is potentially conflictive. And since even-numbered figures are more associated with matter and with nature and are considered feminine, it is a structure that is fundamentally divisive, and that it requires attention to hold it all together. The square is said to be the most internally divisive of all of them. It represents the four elements which don't agree with each other at all, and so there's a constant struggle between them. So in this way, the odd number figures, by the same kind of mathematical thinking, represent spirit. And they don't have that same kind of internal divisiveness, and that's exactly what you find, that the spiritual realms are more subtle. The center of being is always invisible, and it's always more harmonious. So it turns out then that the odd-numbered figures indicate consciousness that is more creative in a spiritual sense, and that the even-numbered figures have, and always the numbers even that relate to them, are more generative in a material sense. So, tying together all of the numbers and the geometric figures through the circle brings a really good understanding of the concepts in the consciousness of the divine that are behind the numbers and that are behind geometric figures, because in simple mathematical manipulations or geometrical manipulations, you can learn a lot from them, and you can come to an understanding about the nature of reality. We see these figures in the world around us, and what their meaning is also pretty obvious. Now, expanding on something that we said earlier, the fact that none of the lines in the pentacle passes through the center indicates the subtle nature of the pentagon or the quintile. And the other odd-numbered figures. The trine, which is the epitome of odd-numbered figures, there's only one way. And that indicates the basic kind of spiritual unity and harmony that is indivisible and is incapable really of being manipulated by a reflection or inversion or things of symmetry of that nature without adding other figures. So this implies then that the pure spirit indicated by the trine is extremely simple and extremely subtle, and it's so subtle that everything that it does is invisible. And you find that in aspects. The trine aspects have talents, and those talents are so perfected that you don't recognize the perfection of the person. It's just that they accomplish something and you're awed by the accomplishment. You don't realize all of the perfection that went into it. So the only possible three simple geometric figures are the square, the trine, and the pentagon. The hexagon, or the six-pointed star that we're going to talk about next time, is connected by oppositions. So we can see in a way that the pentagon is a bridge between the square and the triangle, because it has the internality like the square does, but the triangle does not, and it has the subtlety of the trine and some kind of, but without the internal tension of the square. This is why, because it has something in common with the trine and the square, it represents a state that is in between spirit and matter. Last time we said that the square represented matter, and that the trine represented spirit, and that the figure of our house with the trine sitting on was the relationship of the materialization of spirit or the spiritualization of matter. Since the pentacle stands in between these two figures, having qualities of both of them, it represents a state between the two of them, and that state is called soul. So the pentacle is called soul, which is the essence of material experience taken into the spirit, or it is the spirit in the process of precipitating matter. Yeah, those are definitions for soul that hold up pretty well. The latter is a definition more from Aristotle, and the former is more Platonistic. This is why I have the book here. If we're looking at it, if you want to look at it, the big, maybe we can even get it on the camera, Jerry. This figure of the 3, 4, 5 Pythagorean triangle.
Hold on.
All right, let me move somewhere here where I can get at it. There.
Just hold it steady and I'll get that.
Yeah. Yeah, great. And that's the 3, 4, 5 triangle. And the masculine being associated with the 3 side, the 4 side with the feminine, and the 5 side with the androgyne youth, or androgyne youth. Now, I'm going to pass these out again. They weren't all used the first time. These are the triangles of construction. Now, if you look at the bottom of the sheet, there is a construction that shows a 1, 2 square root of 5 triangle that you have to produce in order to produce a 72 or a 144 degree angle, and in order to produce a pentacle. However, in order to do that, somewhere in the construction, there has to be the division of a line means and extreme. Oh, let's do it like this. This is a line that is divided means and extreme. A, B, C. And when a line is divided means and extreme, AC is to BC as BC is to AB. That is to say that this piece is to this piece as this piece is to the whole. This is called the golden ratio. And when you have a line segment that is divided according to the golden ratio, it is called a golden section. Now, there are all kinds of beautiful things you can do with this. All right.
You can do them provided you have the right ruler.
Yeah. Now, this is a golden section, and this is a golden section. And if you keep expanding golden sections such that you put the next one out here, and then the next one out here, you get the logarithmic spiral, which this is not a very good drawing of it because it's not even a rough approximation, it's just rough.
That's the idea.
Yeah, but you get the whole idea. Now, and this is important throughout nature. The relationship, this ratio here of the golden section is 1 to 1.68, is it? 61803 is what that ratio is. And it can be produced numerically, so that if in a number sequence such that if you take 0 and then 1 and add them together, you get 1, and then you add those together and you get 2, you add those together and you get 3, you add those together and you get 5, 8, and such like that. -1, -1, -2, -3, -5. This is called the Fibonacci series. It's a numerical way of representing what is given geometrically in the golden section. It is in everything in nature. Anything that grows, like if you take a very simple example is like the shell of a snail. It grows with this curve. And the growth rate of something starting very little and growing is indicated by the logarithmic spiral, at least as long as things grow. Now, if you think about the logarithmic spiral, the golden section, that this is to this as this is to the whole thing, that this is a geometric representation of as above, so below. The whole thing is to the big unit as the big unit is to the small unit. And that is a geometric representation of as above, so below. What has gone before in heaven will follow after on earth. So this means that what is called the Hermetic axiom, the principle of analogy, is a two-way creation and dissolution principle. And this actually works. That means the process that is involved in materializing a creative spiritual impulse through thought and concretizing it represents a state of consciousness. And that a posture of consciousness, I don't know how to say it any other way, but when that posture of consciousness is how the creative act is brought into fulfillment into the physical or into the concrete, or how an experience in the concrete is taken into the spiritual is through the same kind of posture. So if you're doing something like a retrospection, sometimes, it doesn't always happen, but sometimes you get yourself into a kind of a zone where all you have to do is to see things. And when you see things, that registers in your spiritual consciousness. And when it registers in your spiritual consciousness, you understand the grand idea of it, which is like the big section. And so from little experiences of life, you can come to grand spiritual principles from which they were created, they're called parent principles. And the same thing is true if you're trying to do creative work, or if you're trying to manifest some kind of deduction. If you put yourself into a posture or a state of consciousness that is what is represented by the golden section, you're capable of doing that. It isn't, you know what I'm trying to say? That there are times that you don't strain yourself, but you just get yourself into the right perspective, and with that perspective, you can materialize things very accurately. That's what we're trying to do with retrospection. We're trying to not make the same mistakes all over again, and if we can get into a place that we can recognize without a doubt, where we have some kind of aha experience from something that we've seen and something that we know, that's what our goal is, because then we have learned something. It is then part of us. All right, this is, as all things are with the pentagram and the pentacle, it's a little bit complicated and it's a little bit indirect. But in practice, it's something like getting to a state of consciousness and then remembering how you got there, or getting the feel of it. Like riding the bicycle. I can remember the first time I rode the bicycle and took off on my own, and ever after that I could do it because I could feel it. And it's something like that. Learning how to focus your eye so that you defocus on some things and focus on other things is another thing that is an analogy to trying to focus your attention so that experiences from memory or experiences from creative consciousness can be focused right. Now this is a little bit abstract, and that's what the whole quality of the pentacle is like in the first place. The presentation is meant to be like the figure that it represents. Now, when we're speaking of these three exclusive equilateral polyhedra, we can get an idea of a progression between them. You can say that things begin with a spiritual conception and a transcendental perfection, and that progresses to the square, representing material compounding or amalgamating things that don't fit together right, and it comes finally, you come to the pentagon, which is how the interaction between the square and the trine, between matter and spirit, can be rationalized, and how in abstract it can be accomplished. All right. Well, this will be very, very short. 45 minutes is what I was figuring it was going to be. Now, we just talked about being able to take postures of consciousness in order to emanate creations. In the ancient mystery schools, especially in the Greek mystery schools, like that of Plato, there were three different degrees of divinity. There are in the Rosicrucian also, but they're stated in a different way. And the work of pure creation, almost like getting something from nothing, was the work of the highest order of divinities. The work of emanating that into manifestation was done by the next highest group of creators. And the next highest group, or the lowest of the three groups, were the fabricators. So the creators are represented by the trine, the emanators, like by the star, the first picture, the first figure with the radii that jut out or sparkle out like a star, and then the fabricators that are just hammering things together are indicated by the square. Now, there's another way that you can get at this intermediary quality of the five-pointed star, or of the pentagon, or of the gyre of five, because it is, again, something that rationalizes between things. Now, suppose you have the frame of a piano, and you have all of the strings of the 12th tone system right next to each other on the piano. If you take a string and you tune it to the one next to it, and then take that one and tune the string next to it, by the time you get all the way through the 12 strings, you'll be way out of tune. And the only way that you can actually tune something like a piano or a harp or something like that, where there are all 12 tones, is to always go to the fifth and cycle through all of the fifths, and then you have things perfectly in tune. So that you take a tonic and the fifth from it and let it become a tonic, and then a fifth from it, and so on, and it becomes perfectly tuned that way. So the interval of the fifth has exactly, in the musical consciousness, it has exactly the same kind of picture of consciousness that the emanation does relative to creation and fabrication, or that the three members of the golden section have to each other. Musical intervals, or getting the feel of a musical interval, is another good way to get at the kind of spiritual posture that you try to get at for what you're trying to accomplish. Like the trine would be shown in something like a major chord, and thus and so on. But the attunement or the relationship of the four-note chords to the three would be indicated by the five. All right. Now, we as humans are fabricators, and our work in the relationship of all the divine creative hierarchies, we're probably the most junior of all of the creative hierarchies. We're just feeble beginners, and our creations are not very good. So in one way, in that sense, we are associated with the square. But the early alchemists and other spiritual writers associated the human figure, with the head being the fifth point, with the five-pointed star. And this was always meant to indicate the microcosm, meaning to say that the human being is a microcosm of the great creation, and that the pentacle is short because the head, meaning to say that in our creative capacity we're very low in our development. And so the six-pointed star, as we're going to see the next time we get together, is the figure of the macrocosm. So we are the quintessence. We are the beings that draw the experience from this world and take it into the spirit. So that you can see all of these themes keep coming back again and again and again, that you get a feel for what the five-pointed star is like. We are the first fruits, you might say, of this solar creation, in that we began when the creation began, and will end when the creation ends, and we come of age of the spirit being in its vehicles at the age in the very middle, when the cosmos, solar cosmos, is of that same age. So we are a peculiar first fruits. Now, the soul material that comes from our experiences in the world, repeated experiences in the world, are organized into the soul body, which is why in the Rosicrucian symbol, for example, the soul body is indicated by the golden five-pointed star. So everything that has to do with five has to do with the with that. I don't know how to say it. if we take, for example, the piano, there are 7 white keys to every 5 keys, the 7s being considered naturals and the black keys being associated with flats and sharps. They're the ones that have the eerie qualities about them. And in the great creation, the number 5 is associated with the states of chaos or the globes of disorganization, where the essence of experience during a manifestation is withdrawn and it becomes general spiritual property of the universal spirit. And so we find the number 5 or the golden star there in a much grander way, that it is represents the abstraction of even the stuff of the creation itself, and it all is taken back into the spirit. So there are these 5 states of dissolution, absorption, assimilation, and abstraction, and there are 5 different kinds of chaos. Now, there does seem in a strange way, Mark and I have talked about this in the past, an association with the number 5 and the pentagon or the pentacle with the earth in itself. The sheet that we're looking at here shows that there are only 5 polyhedra, regular polyhedra. The tetrahedron, the cube, the octahedron, the dodecahedron, and the icosahedron. They're the only 5 possible. In a solid geometry course, you prove that. So they are called the perfect Platonic solids. And they are the only 5 that can be produced where every face is the same as every other face, and every line is the same as every other line in the figure. So some people actually believe that these underlie everything in nature, not only music, but even the earth itself. Plato says, for example, that if you get out into space a great distance and look back at the earth, he says it looks like a ball that we make for our children to play with, which is like a soccer ball, which is with something like the dodecahedrons. Again, the dodecahedron is based on 12 around the 13th, meaning to say that if you have 12, if you have a point of a definite radius, or just a point that just has position, the most points that you can put around it in 3-dimensional space are 12. And that is called a close-packed structure. And close-packed structures are the entire basis of what is called the solid state. Anything that is a solid is a crystal. But if you take atoms that are of different sizes and you pack them around this close packed structure, you don't get one of the 5 perfect solids. You get one of some other type of 5 other crystalline structures. I forget the names of them all, because they're based on the so-called, what might be called the diameter of the atoms, depending on how many shells there are. When you put them together on a dodecahedron, or when you're packing them together as closely as you can, you get the various crystalline kinds of structures. Moreover, there is the thing that if you have earth and you get it soaking wet and you let it dry out, it cracks. And it cracks more frequently in 5-sided figures than any other figure. And I've gone out doing this intentionally from everywhere from Death Valley to other places where I've seen ponds dry out, and it is true there are usually more 4 or 5-sided figures. They aren't always regular, but there are 5-sided figures. Some people believe, following along the lines of Plato, that even the Earth breaks up in like what are called tectonic plates, would eventually fall along lines of pentagons. Now we have one more handout here. And this is from Chinese astrology, from the alchemists or the Taoists or the astrologers of China. And when we look at this figure, we see there are 5 elements in it: earth, metal, water, wood, fire. In the same way that in the West we have fire, air, water, and earth as the 4 basic elements, they have 5 elements in Chinese thought. And but you can't think about them the same way that you think about Western thought, because it's a totally different mindset. They make a lot of sense relating to each other, and they have meanings. Each of the elements is associated with one of the visible planets. Visible planets being Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And then each planet can be positive or negative depending on whether it is associated with the sun or with the moon. The way this goes is, if you look at the outside of the figure, there is a pentagram. And the pentagram relates to harmonies between the elements. Starting in the lower right corner, wood produces fire. Fire leaves ash or earth behind it. Earth produces metal. Metal contains water. Water grows wood. And so those are harmonious to each other. But if you look at the pentacle inside, that shows how they are unharmonious with which are unharmonious to which. Like, let's begin on the upper left with earth. Earth dams water, water douses fire, fire melts metal, metal cuts wood, wood covers earth, is the way it goes in their Chinese way of thinking. And so they have all kinds of ways of finding different parts of the body related in the same way. Like a water part of the body would be, would be treated with either metal or wood, but not with earth, and thus like that. Now, you can take these and you can astrologize them. Earth is the closest that they have to a neutral, and that would be Mercury. And you look at the star facing you, and on the right side would be the diurnals, would be Mars and Jupiter, and on the left side would be Venus and Saturn. Mars would obviously be with fire, and thus like that. It's the exact flip of what we have on the sheet. All right. I'm not familiar with how it works in their alchemy. I know a little bit about the astrology from reading of it years ago. Now, I'm familiar with the mathematical and the philosophical basis of the quintile, which is what we've been talking about, but I have very little practical experience of it. And only on rare occasions have I felt the need to refer to it, because I couldn't find anything anywhere else that described what the behavior was. Obviously, the quintile is a minor aspect. And there are 2 different types of quintiles. Again, if you go on the outside like this, this is quintile to this or to this. But if you go take the star form, this is considered a biquintile. This would be biquintile. That would be biquintile to this point A. The quintile is 72 degrees, and the biquintile is 144 degrees. I have never yet met an astrologer that is knowledgeable about the quintile and biquintile. I've heard references now and then made to it by people, but I've never found anybody that's knowledgeable and is experienced. I would expect that you would have to have a very small orb. I would think 2 degrees or more. You certainly couldn't have a 60-degree orb, because if you think a 6-degree orb, because if you think of it, a sextile is 60 degrees and a quintile is 72 degrees, and that leaves 12 degrees in between them, so they would be abutting each other, and you wouldn't know whether the effect you were getting, whether it was a sextile or whether it was a quintile. And there are similar things with the 144 degrees and other aspects in its neighborhood. So, I doubt, to my knowledge, that there are astrologers that can tell you the difference between a quintile and a biquintile. It's difficult. You have to sit down and map out the distances between every planet and every other planet. I know that there are some astrological programs that do that. And if you have that, then you can determine whether there is a quintile. Now, from everything that has been said, it is clear that the quintile should have something to do with the state of consciousness whereby one absorbs something and assimilates it into the spirit, or whereby one can predict from abstract, can project something from abstract into concrete. And in the same way that there is that feeling that when you look at what happened and then you understand, well, that's what that means, if you can reproduce that feeling, that is the feeling that is most likely what the quintile aspect is like, if you're trying to work with horoscopes and see what the quintile is all about. Beyond that, the quintile and biquintile are associated with soul states. Like if a person does a lot of work out of the body and you can't find that associated with the 4th, 8th, and 12th houses, which would indicate the opportunities to do so, the facility to do that would be indicated by the quintile or the biquintile. And similarly, things that have to do with work in between lives, when all the soul material is compounded and built into the spirit during the normal life cycle. Those are places that I would begin to look. But I haven't had the opportunity to do a lot of looking. And what I was planning to do is that in our next meeting, I was going to take a bunch of obvious quintile horoscopes and try to give examples. But after spending hours and hours on the database, it turns out that the search engine for the database that I have does not find quintiles and biquintiles. And I tried to trick it this way and that. And for example, going through all 50,000 horoscopes, giving a 10-degree orb for a quintile, I didn't find a single one. That means, and that's almost mathematically impossible. So I'm going to try one more time to see whether I can find any examples of it, and if I can't, I will move on the next time to the sextile, and we won't have examples because it takes way, way, way too many hours to find quintiles and then study a person's life and draw the information out. Okay. That's all I have to offer. It was more like a math night than it was like an astrology night, but math is good that way for giving ideas.
Since that's earthy, that might have to do with come into life as a male one time, female the next, and it also has to then would have to do with
The androgyne male-female, yeah.
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 You know, consistently opposite. There's another thing, and I'll ask you about that later.
Okay. Any comments, Mark?
No.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.